The morning light streamed through the narrow windows of Emily's childhood home, falling in soft rectangles across the worn wooden floor. She sat by the living room window in her wheelchair, staring at the garden just beyond the front steps. The scent of dew-laden grass drifted through a cracked pane, taunting her with the freedom it symbolized. She reached for the small remote that controlled her wheelchair, the action fluid from years of repetition. The wheels hummed as they carried her to the front door, but as always, the steps leading outside stopped her in her tracks. 4 uneven, splintered slabs of wood stood between her and the world. "Emily, breakfast!" her mother called from the kitchen. Emily sighed and turned the chair, moving away from the doorway and toward the kitchen. Her mother bustled around, placing toast and scrambled eggs on the table. "Thanks, Mom," Emily said, parking her chair at the corner of the table. Her mother gave her a warm smile, but it didn't mask the concern in her eyes. "Did you sleep okay?" Emily shrugged. "Fine, I guess." The truth was, she had spent most of the night reading. Her science book sat on the table beside her plate, its pages marked with sticky notes. The cover showed an illustration of a DNA helix, its bright colors practically glowing under the morning light. "You're going to wear that book out?" her mother teased, pouring coffee into her mug. "I don't mind," Emily replied, her voice tinged with quiet enthusiasm. "It's fascinating. Did you know that DNA is like a blueprint for everything in our bodies? It's incredible how something so small can hold so much information." Her mother nodded, though the words seemed to float past her. Emily felt the usual pang of isolation. No one in her family shared her passion for science, and she often felt like an alien trying to explain her world to people who didn't speak her language. As breakfast ended, Emily wheeled herself back to the living room, her mind already drifting to the next chapter in her book. She picked it up, flipping to a page about cellular regeneration. Her fingers traced the diagram of a cell, her mind buzzing with questions. "Emily, don't forget your exercises," her mother called from the kitchen. "I won't," she replied absently. But her thoughts were already elsewhere, on the idea of tiny miracles happening inside every living thing, unseen but essential. The sound of children playing outside filtered in through the window, laughter mingling with the distant hum of a lawnmower. Emily glanced outside again, her gaze lingering on the garden. Her brother had left his soccer ball on the grass, and for a moment she imagined herself running out to join the game. But the vision faded as quickly as it came. She turned back to her book, determination hardening in her chest. If her body wouldn't let her run, then her mind would carry her. She would learn, discover, and build a path to the world she dreamed of, a world without steps. The morning light shifted as clouds rolled in, but Emily didn't notice. Her pencil scratched across the margin of her book, capturing an idea she would explore later. In her mind, the seeds of her future were already taking root. The classroom buzzed with low murmurs as Emily wheeled herself to the desk in the back corner. She had learned early on that sitting in the front often drew too much attention, the curious stares, the whispered questions about her wheelchair. The back was her refuge, her bubble of quiet focus. "Class, settle down!" Mr. Harris clapped his hands, his booming voice instantly silencing the chatter. "Today, we're starting a new unit, astronomy. Who here has looked up at the night sky and wondered what's out there?" Emily raised her hand, though not very high, and looked around as others enthusiastically waved theirs. She had always wondered about the stars, but her questions went deeper. How far were they, really? What forces held them together? "Good," Mr. Harris continued. "I want you to think of space as a laboratory. Everything up there follows rules we can discover and understand." As he spoke, Emily felt her pulse quicken. The idea of rules hidden in the universe, waiting to be uncovered, thrilled her. Her hand shot up again, this time with a question. "Mr. Harris, do the same rules apply to everything? Like, is gravity the same here as it is on the moon?" The class turned to look at her, but she didn't notice. Mr. Harris smiled. "Excellent question, Emily. Gravity does change depending on where you are. We'll dive into that later, but you've hit on one of the big ideas in science, universal laws with local differences. Well done." The compliment warmed her, but more importantly, it fueled her curiosity. For the rest of the lesson, Emily scribbled notes, furiously, filling the margins of her notebook with ideas and questions. After class, Mr. Harris stopped her as she moved toward the door. "Emily, I have something for you." He handed her a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "What's this?" "Your curiosity reminds me of why I became a teacher. It's a chemistry set, basic, but it's a good start. Experiment with it, and let me know what you discover." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she took the box. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. On the way home, the box sat on her lap, heavy with possibility. As she crossed the threshold of her home and entered her room, she felt for the first time that her dreams, like the stars, might be within reach. The bus pulled up to the curb with a loud hiss, and Emily glanced at the small lift designed for wheelchairs. It was broken again. The driver shrugged apologetically. "I can call another bus, but it'll be at least half an hour," he said. Emily nodded, biting back her frustration. She was used to waiting. It was a routine part of her life: delays, inconveniences, and the unspoken message that the world wasn't built for her. She decided to wheel herself home instead, navigating the uneven sidewalks and narrow curbs. The sun beat down on her, and by the time she reached her neighborhood, her arms ached. At the corner of her street, she saw a group of kids from her school playing basketball. They paused as she approached, their laughter fading into awkward silence. "Hey, Emily!" one of them called, his voice forcedly cheerful. "Wanna join?" The sarcasm wasn't lost on her, but she smiled tightly. "Maybe next time," she replied, rolling past them. Her heart ached, but not because of their teasing. It was the reminder that so much of life seemed to move without her, leaving her behind. At home, she opened her chemistry set and spread the tools across her desk. Here, at least, she was in control. She mixed solutions, recorded observations, and felt a sense of purpose returning. As she watched a small beaker bubble over with her latest experiment, she thought about the obstacles she had faced that day. If the world wasn't built for her, she decided, she would change it, piece by piece, experiment by experiment. The kitchen table was strewn with papers, university brochures, application forms, and handwritten notes. Emily sat with her mother, who scanned each page with furrowed brows. "Are you sure about this, Emily? It's so far away and—" Her mother hesitated. "And what?" Emily asked, her tone sharper than intended. Her mother sighed. "It's just, university is hard for anyone. And for you, with the logistics." Emily bristled. "You mean the wheelchair?" "I didn't say that," her mother said softly. "You didn't have to." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock. Emily looked down at the acceptance letter in her hands, the words, "Congratulations," and "We are pleased to welcome you," blurring as her eyes filled with tears. "I can do this, Mom," she said finally. "I have to. I want to study science, and this school has the best program." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know you can. I just worry about you. Always have." Emily smiled faintly. "I know." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Emily researched accessibility options at the university, applied for scholarships, and packed her belongings. On the day she left, her family gathered to see her off, their mixed emotions visible in their expressions. As the train pulled away from the station, Emily felt a surge of excitement and fear. She was leaving behind the world she knew for one that was bigger, more challenging, and full of unknowns. But she was ready. For the first time, the steps ahead didn't feel like barriers, they felt like opportunities. The university campus was overwhelming. Emily had arrived a week earlier to get settled, but even now, as she navigated through the sprawling walkways in her wheelchair, it felt like the world was moving faster than she could catch up. Students rushed between buildings, talking in clusters, carrying books and coffee cups, unaware of the obstacles that Emily faced. The campus was beautiful, an old stone structure, wide open spaces, and large lawns, but it was not designed with her in mind. She reached the entrance to her first class, Introduction to Chemistry, and hesitated for a moment. The door was heavy, and she had to use all her strength to pull it open. As she wheeled herself inside, the room grew quiet. Every eye was on her, and the sound of shifting feet felt like the world's collective breath. "Hi, I'm Emily," she said, forcing a smile as she rolled toward an empty seat. "I'll be taking this class along with you all." Her professor, Dr. Langley, was a tall man with round glasses and a warm smile. "Welcome, Emily. Please make yourself comfortable." He gestured toward the desk in the front row, where she would have a clear view of the board. Emily took her seat, grateful for his kindness but acutely aware of the difference between the classroom of her dreams and the reality before her. The lecture began, and she fell into the rhythm of the lesson. But her mind kept wandering to the little details. The fact that some of the tables were too narrow for her chair, the slight incline of the floor, the fact that no one had even thought to consider how someone with mobility challenges might interact with the space. The first day ended in a blur of new information, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was, in some way, out of place. Everyone else seemed to have a set path, one that didn't involve extra barriers to overcome. At lunch, she found a quiet corner in the dining hall, her tray of food beside her. As she ate, she overheard a conversation at the table next to hers. "I just don't get it," a girl said, glancing over at Emily. "I mean, how is she even going to keep up with the workload? It must be so much harder with, all the extra stuff she has to deal with." The word stung. Emily lowered her gaze, trying not to show the hurt. But deep inside, the doubt crept in. Would she be able to keep up? Was she just fooling herself? A week later, Emily found herself struggling more than she'd anticipated. Her classes were demanding, and the sheer physical exhaustion of navigating campus daily was taking its toll. She hadn't yet figured out the best way to organize her schedule between classes, assignments, and her personal needs. And the loneliness of living in a dorm where no one seemed to understand what she was going through began to weigh heavily on her. One rainy afternoon, Emily was rushing to her chemistry lab when the wheels of her chair got caught in a puddle. She tried to free them, but the more she struggled, the deeper her chair sank into the muddy water. Her hands gripped the armrests, her face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. I'm stuck," she muttered to herself. Just then, a voice broke through her haze of panic. "Hey, need some help?" Emily looked up to find a tall, curly-haired student offering her hand. It was Caleb, a fellow chemistry major. They had briefly spoken before, but today, he seemed to be the first person to notice her struggle. "Yeah," she said, relieved but trying to maintain her composure. "Thank you." Together, they maneuvered her chair free from the puddle, and Caleb rolled it to the sidewalk where the ground was less slippery. "You okay?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, but the tears she'd been holding back threatened to spill. She wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion, the weight of everything that felt too hard, or just the kindness of a stranger that overwhelmed her. "I didn't think it would be this hard," she admitted, her voice unsteady. Caleb gave her a sympathetic smile. "University's a big leap for anyone. You're doing great." "Thanks," she murmured, wiping away a tear quickly. He shrugged. "It's nothing. I'm Caleb, by the way." "Emily. Well, if you ever need help with anything, I'm here," he said, pushing her chair a little further down the sidewalk. Over the next few weeks, Caleb became Emily's first real friend at university. They studied together, laughed at bad chemistry jokes, and shared their frustrations. Caleb was a solid support system, and his encouragement reminded her why she had come here in the first place. One late afternoon, as Emily worked in the lab, a spark of realization ignited within her. She had been experimenting with a new compound, carefully combining substances and making detailed observations. The formula she had been working on for weeks was finally starting to take shape. With trembling hands, she recorded her results, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. This was why she had come here. This was her purpose. And no amount of struggle, no matter how heavy, could take that from her. By the time Emily presented her first scientific paper at the student conference, she was nervous, but determined. Her research on a new compound, a catalyst for enhancing cellular regeneration, had been groundbreaking. It was an idea she developed after countless hours in the lab, mixing and testing. The hours of solitude and frustration were paying off, but the idea of presenting her work to an audience filled her with dread. The auditorium was buzzing with the energy of students and professors eager to hear the latest developments in their fields. Emily wheeled herself to the front of the stage, the spotlight casting an intimidating glare over the crowd. Her heart pounded as she adjusted her notes, trying to steady her breath. Then, as she began to speak, she found her rhythm. She spoke about her research with passion, her voice steadying as she described the potential applications of her work. How her discovery might help those with mobility impairments. How science, when applied with empathy, could change lives. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then, a slow, enthusiastic clap started at the back of the room, gradually building into a standing ovation. Emily blinked, stunned. She had expected to be met with polite applause, nothing more. But this was something else. As she left the stage, a professor from the Department of Biomedical Science approached her. "That was impressive," he said, extending a hand. "Your research is exactly the kind of forward thinking we need in this field. I'd like to talk to you about collaborating on a project next semester." Emily felt her stomach flutter. This was it, the opportunity she had been waiting for. It was more than recognition. It was a chance to make a difference. She shook the professor's hand, a new sense of purpose settling in her chest. The scientist she had always dreamed of becoming was finally emerging, piece by piece. Emily's lab had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the challenges of the outside world and focus entirely on her work. Surrounded by test tubes, microscopes, and books stacked high, she was no longer just a student at university, she was a scientist. Her latest project had become personal. She had always been passionate about medicine, but now, as she delved deeper into the science of mobility and physical disabilities, the research felt more meaningful than ever. She was determined to create a treatment that would help people like her, those whose bodies didn't always cooperate with their dreams. Emily spent countless hours researching the neural mechanisms behind motor impairment, testing different compounds to promote nerve regeneration. Some days the results were discouraging. Other times she would stumble upon something small, a breakthrough, a glimmer of hope. One late night, as the sterile glow of the lab lights illuminated her workspace, Emily's eyes widened as she read over her latest results. The compound she had synthesized appeared to stimulate increased nerve growth in lab mice. It was a small step, but it was significant. It meant there was potential to create treatments that could improve mobility, not just for people like her, but for anyone who struggled with similar impairments. She sat back in her chair, staring at the data. She had finally found something that could change lives, her own, and the lives of so many others. But it wasn't enough to stop there. Emily knew the hard work had only just begun. The next steps would be crucial: testing, refining, and eventually applying for funding. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was ready for it. She was no longer afraid. The boardroom was cold, its polished table reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror. Emily sat at the head of the table, her hands pressed firmly against the surface. Across from her sat a panel of medical professionals, investors, and research directors, all of them waiting for her to present her findings. Her heart raced, but she had prepared for this moment for months. This was the culmination of all the sleepless nights, the hours spent poring over data, and the countless experiments that had led her here. She had something important to share. "Good afternoon," Emily began, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "My name is Emily Rivers, and I've developed a compound that shows great potential in regenerating motor neurons and improving mobility for those with disabilities." The room was quiet, but she could feel their attention, the weight of their expectations. She showed them the data, the promising results, and the potential applications of her research. Emily was determined to show them that a person with a disability could contribute to the scientific community in a way that no one had imagined before. As she spoke, the room's skepticism started to fade. Some nodded in approval, others exchanged looks of cautious optimism. But it wasn't until she mentioned the possibility of clinical trials that the mood shifted. "I know the road to approval is long and difficult," Emily said, her voice firm now. "But this research has the potential to change everything. Not just for me, but for millions of people who are waiting for a solution." One of the investors, a man with graying hair and a skeptical expression, raised an eyebrow. "You're asking for funding, then?" "Yes," Emily replied. "But more than that, I'm asking for a chance. A chance to prove that people with disabilities are capable of doing more than just overcoming challenges. We can create change. We can lead." The silence stretched out, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, the director of the research department spoke. "I've seen the data, and I have to admit I'm impressed. This could be groundbreaking. We'll be in touch to discuss the next steps." Emily felt a rush of relief, but more than that, she felt pride. This wasn't just about funding. This was about proving that people like her, people with disabilities, belonged in spaces like this, at the forefront of scientific research. Years later, Emily stood at the podium of a global medical conference, her heart racing, her mind focused. The crowd in the auditorium was filled with the world's leading scientists, medical professionals, and innovators. They had gathered to hear her present her findings, the culmination of her research on regenerative treatments for motor disabilities. "Thank you all for being here," Emily began, her voice clear and confident. "It's an honor to be able to share my work with you today. But before I dive into the science, I want to tell you a little bit about why I do this." The room quieted as she paused. "I'm a scientist. I'm a researcher. But more than that, I'm someone who has lived with a disability my entire life. And I know that for many people with disabilities, the world can feel like an endless series of barriers." She glanced down at the slides on the screen behind her, showing the progress she had made in her work, cell regeneration techniques that had already begun clinical trials, the potential for life-changing treatments on the horizon. "As a child, I dreamed of being part of a world where my body didn't limit me," she continued. "I wanted to explore, to discover, to contribute. And today, I stand before you, not just as a researcher, but as someone who has lived that dream. I've proven that disability is not a barrier to success, it's a part of who I am, and it's shaped the work I do." The audience was still, their expressions a mix of respect and admiration. And then, slowly, the applause began. It started softly, but soon, it grew into a standing ovation. Emily stood there, her heart swelling with emotion. She had not only achieved her academic dream, but she had also paved the way for others like her. Her research would change lives. Her story would inspire others to believe that they, too, could break through the barriers that society had set for them. And as she looked out over the room, filled with people who had once doubted her, she realized that the horizon she had always dreamed of was finally within her reach.